All right. I'm going to refer back to JDK9 actually twice more. It's kind of cross-cutting a little. So, if there are any other questions, of course, on JDK9, feel free to drop them in as they materialize, right? So we can refer back to things we've been discussing before, also at the very end. No worries. But this one is actually related. JDK9 ships an ALP-NV v3 stack, which is basically the SSL stack in an incarnation that is ready to serve HTTP2. It's the first JDK generation to do so. So inferring this back to JDK8, of course, we have a bit of an issue with existing JDK8 installations here. I mean, HTTP2 is such an obvious step forward, from what we've been using before, that it's really a bit of a shame that we are not quite ready to embrace it wholesale in the Java industry yet. I mean, a lot of stakeholders did their job, right? The browsers, the mobile browsers, a lot of the networking infrastructure out there is already at least ready for HTTP2. And the initiator is always a client, right? A client talks to a server system and it suggests to use HTTP 2.0 instead of 1.1. If the server refuses to do so, it falls back to HTTP 1.1 communication. So obviously, everything works in any case. But it's a bit of a shame that in particular for Java-based servers, that is the norm at the moment. We are forcing all the clients to downgrade to HTTP 1.1, even if the clients would be perfectly ready and willing to use HTTP 2. HTTP 2 with all of its benefits, the binary representation at runtime, the connection multiplexing, and my favorite is actually headers compression, this sort of total nonsense that we do in HTTP 1.1 where we repeat the same headers for every single HTTP request that we're sending from the same client to the same server. This stuff is so obvious, put a symbolic reference onto this combination of headers and the next request says same headers as in the previous request, right? Saves quite a bit of bandwidth, in particular in this modern world with all the little short HTTP requests that we are sending all over the world. So HTTP 2 is, from that perspective, really important for modern day web architectures. HTTP 1.1 was perfectly good enough for a long while, right? 20 years, basically. But we really need HTTP 2 right now for what we're doing, for all the kinds of architectures that we have already and for the ones we're going to build over the next few years. We really need this. By the way, in case you have been familiarizing yourself with HTTP 2, the whole push resources stuff in my book is actually the least important feature in HTTP 2. So it's a little bit like, maybe Jigsaw, it's not the same kind of comparison. It doesn't really work, I guess. But everything else is so worth having and so transparently available to our applications that basically forget about the whole resource push thing. That's not the reason you're going to use HTTP 2. Why am I saying this? In Servlet 4.0, which is the first specification coming up in the Servlet world, right? The first Servlet version that actually enforces HTTP 2 support. Finally, it's not actually there yet, so also scheduled for July, along with the Java EE8 umbrella. It's great that we get a Servlet specification finally saying that all Servlet containers implementing Servlet 4.0 have to provide HTTP 2 support out of the box. That's great. But if we look a little bit more closely, the Servlet specification itself doesn't actually do that much about HTTP 2, because that's largely a wire protocol business, right? At the servlet level, servlet is an abstraction after all, right? It abstracts requests and responses in a way where we can totally ignore HTTP 2 1.1 versus HTTP 2 for pretty much all purposes, right? A servlet-based application does not have to take HTTP 2 into account. It's largely an infrastructure problem. Setting up the servlet container, setting up the protocol stack at the JDK level in a way where the runtime server is able to accept HTTP 2 applications, all the applications that we have are kind of naturally capable to work with HTTP2, to accept HTTP2 requests and send HTTP2 responses without much change. Admittedly, there may be some things you can finally do that you were not able to do before. You may be able to do some optimizations if you know that you're running on HTTP2. There's always the bonus, right? But you get a lot of the benefit by just upgrading the servlet infrastructure and running the same application on an HTTP2 ready servlet container. Now, in Servlet 4.0, that doesn't really show, because the transparent benefits, well, there's some text in the PDF file, right? In the Servlet specification PDF that talks about this, but Servlet 4.0 API-wise basically doesn't really have HTTP2 specific changes, except for the new push builder. So what happens? Everybody, both the Servlet expert group and a lot of the coverage out there, if somebody talks about Servlet 4, writes an article about Servlet 4, conference presentations about Servlet 4, they always talk about the push builder. The only new API, basically in Servlet 4. Not entirely true, there are a few new setters on servlet context, but it's the only really interesting new API in Servlet 4. And the shame here is that I don't really see a need to programmatically trigger pushes. I have no idea, even after 2+ years, I have no idea what to actually, who to recommend this to, right? If you're building a framework with certain correlation assumptions or correlation knowledge about certain resources, you could try to proactively push them programmatically, but in a regular application, by all means, just forget about it. There's even a discussion out there in the HTTP2, in the wider ecosystem around HTTP2, whether it's even a good idea to do this, to do this ever. But the only mechanisms I saw that I liked are in the servers themselves, where the servers infer certain correlations from typical request patterns, right? So a server can learn that if a certain request comes, usually there's these other requests following for it comes some JS or CSS resources. It knows that the same client is going to send certain kinds of requests for certain resources in immediate succession. So by learning that statistical pattern, it can proactively push those resources on the first request already. It's something you can leave up to the server. It's basically server configuration. I don't see this creeping into our application code. So from an application perspective, Servlet 4 is basically a transparent, almost boring upgrade. The only really interesting part is the HTTP2 support in the products, in the server containers, in the servers themselves. And ironically, for that part, it's not so important that a server actually is Servlet 4.0 compliant. We have Servlet 3.1 containers right now, like Tomcat 8.5, JD 9.4, and Undertow 1.4 underneath Wildfly, but also independently. All of those are HTTP2 ready. They are Servlet 3.1 containers. They don't have a push builder API, but the transparent benefits of HTTP2, they already deliver for Servlet 3.1 based applications. That's what we strongly recommend at this point. If you're interested in embracing HTTP2 at all, in enabling HTTP2 at all, check out the latest versions of those containers. The tricky part is the JDK setup, the protocol stack in the JDK, but they all have ways of getting around it. As long as you can modify your JDK installation, it's all doable right now. So by all means do this. Don't wait for Servlet 4.0, the PDF file, and don't wait for Servlet 4.0 products either, even if Tomcat 9 is pretty advanced in the meantime, pretty far along. Don't wait for those. We have a tendency in the Java ecosystem to always wait on things, on somebody else to formally declare something, right? It's a bit of an excuse to say, like, I can't do HTTP2 because I have to wait for Servlet 4. It's just not true. If you're saying I'm waiting for a JDK 8 upgrade to finally give me an ALPN v3 stack out of the box, that's a better argument in case you need an excuse. But that's actually planned to come. Unfortunately, there's no hard statement on that yet, but common sources, or actually the people deciding this, do say that they want to ship a JDK8 update along with JDK9, so also in July, where they backport that SSL stack, right, that ALPN stack, to JDK8 update. I don't know what that's going to be, 130, whatever. That's actually the one single thing I'm really looking forward to, not servlet for containers. The moment that we get an ALPN v3 stack in JDK8, in a JDK8 update, it's much easier to configure existing servers to use HTTP2. That's really a step forward. That's what we need, right? Or of course, go to JDK9 right away. You're going to get the stack there out of the box for sure. So that's what we're focusing on at the moment. We are already for quite a while. We're trying to do everything we can to enable the use of HTTP2 in Spring-based applications. On the server side, by supporting those latest servers in Spring Boot and also at the framework level, which is not always so trivial. We do embrace Servlet 4. We have early Servlet 4.0 API support already in Spring Framework 5.0 M5. Even my special darling push builder, in a Spring MVC handler method on Spring Framework 5.0 M5, you can declare a push builder argument in your Spring MVC handler method signature, and we're going to give it to you. Even if, from the servlet request, right? If you're running on a servlet 4 container, like on Tomcat 9, Milestone 17, or whatever it is, we're going to give it to you, but I unfortunately don't really have a recommendation for when to use it. But if you know that you want to use it, it's there, and first class injected into an MVC handler method. So we are testing against Tomcat 9 and Servlet 4.0 in general already. We have the mocks, like our servlet mocks, updated to Servlet 4 level, including the new setters for session timeouts and encodings on the server context. So we're doing everything we can to have early Servlet 4.0 support. But being pragmatic, what's most important is actually this, making it work in practice, in production, and not waiting for Servlet 4.0 part. There's so much more to say about this, right? Almost worth a dedicated talk. Like in a microservices architecture, you're going to implement quite a bit of programmatic HTTP, basically programmatic HTTP client usage, right? You're going to initiate HTTP requests from one service to the other. Of course, it's equally important, if you want to embrace HTTP2, that those programmatic clients are actually HTTP2 capable, which is non-trivial. There is no HTTP2 support in the JDK itself, not even in JDK9, not in the regular Java SE9. There's only an optional experimental HTTP2 client that nobody's going to use because it's marked as experimental, even if they ship it out of the box and it's a separate module. You know, I don't see the point of why they're even shipping it. The only way of doing HTTP2 for a programmatic client is to use an external library, like OK HTTP 3 at least is HTTP2 capable. So revisiting the client libraries, if you're using Spring's REST template, setting up REST template with the OK HTTP 3 client request factory may be a really good idea for a really complete HTTP2 story. All right, let's leave it at that.